Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds podcast where we interview key entrepreneurs, scientists, and activists who are shaping the real estate industry and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we'll be speaking with Trisha Talbot, the host of the Providers, Properties, and Performance podcast and the managing principal of Doc Properties. Trisha is one of the leading voices in the healthcare real estate investing industry, and on the podcast, we discuss the keys to building strong industry relationships, tricks to investing in the rising interest rate environment, and strategies for successfully performing a medical office 1031 exchange. Hey, Trisha, great to have you on the podcast today. I wanted to start off and see if you could give a little brief introduction about your background and kind of your unique aptitude for medical office space.
Sure. Well, my entire career has been in medical office and healthcare real estate. I started as an in-house leasing agent for a developer of medical office buildings. And then since then, I've gone into third-party brokerage and had a ton of landlord leasing portfolio at one point, and then got into investment sales and then corporate representation. So I sort of have a 360-degree view of probably every facet of healthcare real estate.
Very cool. So on that, you have a wide view of understanding the healthcare market. And I wanted to ask you one thing, because I think in particular, you do a great job of differentiating yourself in a pretty dense real estate crowd. How can a young broker differentiate themselves in the real estate industry?
Yeah, and that's becoming, I think, tougher because I think with the pandemic, at least all the senior brokers I know just started working from home, and I don't know that they've gone back. So that makes it really tough for young brokers to learn because a lot of it is through osmosis. But, the best thing would be to find a team that you can add value. I would say, as a young broker, you're going to be doing a lot of market research. You're going to be doing a lot of the detail work. So as much as you can position yourself with, business degree, finance, accounting, to be able to help in that arena, to just have really great organization skills, be able to support these brokers. So, basically your goal as a young broker is to make the senior brokers as efficient as possible, because they're the ones that are going out and getting the deals and the clients at this point, just because as a young broker, you don't have that network. But you can help support them and make them more efficient. And the more that you can make them more efficient, the more you're going to learn. And then, you'll be able to progress and build your own network, because the more you learn, the more access to the clients and that you're going to have, and then, eventually develop your own client base. But being part of a team, I think it's really hard to start out in brokerage and be on your own. It's just, I think the internet is both a connector and a challenge, if you don't already have the network. So I think the internet and, Zoom and all of these social programs, they're great at connecting you once you sort of have some sort of established presence and track record. And it's really hard, that you've developed offline, that you just support yourself online. But as a young broker, I think it's hard, to start virtually and be successful.
I think that's so true. Real estate is certainly all about relationships. And I think it's particularly hard if you're a young broker in a flat world, right? In the real estate world of the internet, to develop some of those relationships. You've done a great job in your career of developing relationships in a wide array of aspects of the medical office industry. Do you have any particular advice for keeping and maintaining strong relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationships I built, just quite honestly, I was a deal junkie for so many years. And the more deals you do, the more people you connect with. And then since then, you start developing relationships with the people that I think operate the same way. You value each other's personalities. And then from there, you start to grow and develop more business together because there's no friction. And, when you can sort of streamline how you operate, things just get done quicker. You kind of anticipate what your client needs. You help streamline them and organize them to help them make decisions quicker because they typically have stakeholders as well. They typically have investors in their properties or business partners that they need to communicate deal points to or opportunities. And the more succinct that you can make that for them, knowing what's important to them, the more you can get done together.
Great advice. So, kind of moving to your specialty,
Mhm.
I think one of the things that a lot of folks that are looking in at the industry or people who are kind of generalists in the industry don't understand is there are really unique and important aspects to each asset class. And I was wondering if you could touch on, since you're one of the foremost medical office experts, what are the key differences between a medical office property and just a typical office property?
Well, a medical office property, so in like general office, I mean, you typically have a general office setup. You have a receptionist, typically a bullpen, and maybe exterior offices and a break room. And that's typically can get, I think, 80% of the users have that same setup with a little bit of, maybe differences. Maybe they have more than one conference room or different size conference rooms or, different size break rooms, that sort of thing. But for the most part, that's the setup of a general office user. And that can be applied for an attorney. It can be applied for an insurance company. It can be applied for a logistics company, with a few tweaks. In medical office, you can have 5 tenants and 5 completely different build outs. You can have a dermatologist, you can have an orthopedic, you can have a cardiologist, you can have a family practice and imaging or lab. They all have a different setup. And typically, and sometimes even within different companies, like they'll have different standard setups. So, if you're working with a national firm, they typically say, okay, this is our footprint. How can you make this footprint work in your building? Otherwise, each of these tenants requires a different build out. What's good with that is that, I would say in general office, you're sometimes in new buildings, you'll get the long-term leases, but typically I think, 3 to 5 is kind of the max in medical office, for having all of these highly specialized build outs that a landlord typically has to fund part of. They in turn get long-term leases. So standard leases, even in second generation buildings, can be more towards the 7 and 10 year time frame, which gives a lot more stability in the asset class. So people in medical office, so it's not as, right now I would say the top um, sexiest commercial real estate food groups, I think, are industrial for the last mile stuff that is going on, and then multifamily continues to be incredibly attractive. But in industrial with the last mile stuff, I think at some point that will saturate
Yeah.
because there's only so many warehouses you can have. And then, with multifamily, those, so I don't know how to underwrite multifamily a little bit, but not too much. But
It's not my
you know,
specialty either. So,
right. I mean, you would think that you have to underwrite like these basically year leases, maybe sometimes 6 months, year leases, max, I think 2 years. I mean, I don't know that anyone leases something and says, yeah, I'm going to be here 5 years because I don't know that they know what their life is going to be like. Um, so there's different people go, but again, I think that they do, they're more, they lease them up and then they sell them for the most part. And in medical office, the investors I think are more long term. So it doesn't get the super highs and lows that other asset classes do, but it's really steady. So like right now, when we're looking at a recession or turbulent economic climate, uh, healthcare is a great investment because an investor can say, okay, I'm going to purchase this now. I know for the next 10 years, I can bank that I'm going to get this cash flow.
so I find that particularly interesting as someone who works with a lot of sometimes less predictable asset classes. I was wondering if you could touch on kind of that predictability of the medical office investment.
Absolutely. So healthcare properties, they're mission purpose built, mission driven, mission critical, purpose driven, and there's a reason for the tenants to be there. The tenants need to, one, be there in order to generate revenue for themselves, or if it's a hospital group, the hospital has them there for a strategic purpose to see patients in that market. And so there's a reason for them to be there. They have to be there. Just practicality, you don't go and get procedures in your home. And I think physicians, it's more efficient for them to have patients come see them than try to go to all these different places to see their patients. So when an investor is looking at a healthcare property, they are looking at it for the long-term stability. So it's not going to have the maybe the super ups and downs of some of the other asset classes, but they can say, okay, there's 10 years of lease term, or the WALT might be 8.5 years. And I know that I'm going to keep this, I'm going to have 5 years of good strong, predictable cash flow because, the tenants are stable, they're financially strong. And, after that, I'll probably renew a couple and then I can sell it. So that's their thought process when they're looking at a healthcare property, and it's a property to add to their portfolio that is stable and predictable. And as we're going into, I think I've said this before, but as we're going into this uncertain economic climate, having healthcare properties in your portfolio guarantees a return on, a pretty predictable recession resilient return.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen that within our own portfolio. Some of our hospital and medical assets have been very resilient through COVID-19. Have you seen that as well in some of the investment properties that you've worked with?
Absolutely. So the landlords in the space, they report that they receive, over like mid 90% of their leases. A lot of the tenants qualified for the PPP loan. A lot of landlords initially put together this whole PPP help program, information, links, and everything for their tenants to go and get access to. So, a lot of them, even though they might have been closed for a few months, depending on the state that you were in, they returned to pretty healthy and quickly throughout the pandemic, because people still needed to get healthcare. If you have cancer, you still have to get chemotherapy. If you have a chronic condition, and if you just want to stay up on your healthcare and not forego seeing a physician for a long period of time, you want to keep up. I mean, pediatricians, they still have to see babies throughout, as they grow, and babies grow pretty fast in the first 2 years of their life. So and a parent isn't going to not see their pediatrician because of a pandemic.
Yeah, that's very true. And in terms of growth, uh, one of the things that investors are looking for is they're looking for growth. The medical asset class is certainly one. Um, when you're looking at long term, what are the factors that are going to be driving a typical good deal for your investors? What are the most important factors that you're looking for?
Well, I think population growth, where there's people, there is a need for healthcare. There's a lot of, interest in what's called the Sun Belt, the Smile States, which is the Sun Belt. But,
Yeah.
I see a ton of transactions everywhere. So I think it depends on where you're at, and if you're in a city that's growing, but even rural communities need healthcare as well. So it really is wherever people are, and there is not a lot of product. So here in Arizona, we have a lot of sprawl. So there's the city center, of course, but then there's the suburbs, and some of the suburbs they're these master plan communities of hundreds of homes get developed, but then there's no services for like 30 miles, or it's a 30-minute drive not 30 miles, but 30-minute drive to get to any services. I mean, grocery stores or, the like for a little while. So of course it starts, a dentist will probably open up or family practice will open up. And then there needs to be a clinic, a multidisciplinary clinic that typically starts with, one day a week, a cardiologist is there, a urologist, an orthopedic. They'll sort of, open up this and start seeing patients. And then they develop this patient base and it grows and they need to see more patients. And, they might start out in like, really like a, a strip center, but then, that's not necessarily the best location. When you start seeing sick patients, just for the dignity of the patients, it's nice to be in a medical center. So then, that usually migrates into developing a small medical office building, then that gets filled and you have to build another one. So, it's just wherever growth is happening and medical services are needed, the supply of properties that are practical to put a medical clinic in, where it's located towards the hospital, where it's located, with its patients, and, ease of access where the patients can find it pretty easily.
So, of course, there's a lot of different deal structures, but one of the things we really like to talk about on the podcast is what does a typically good deal look like for you? And uh, look, we can talk about all sorts of broad factors, but one of the things that I find particularly interesting with each asset class is the idea of finding a good development versus a redevelopment versus a value add through leasing or some other major factor. What is it that you're typically searching for in a good deal, or do you kind of work with all three of those major methods?
Yeah, it depends. So with value add, there's some very experienced and sophisticated landlords in the healthcare space. So they want to buy a building and it's either a second generation medical building that still has some really good bones, but for whatever reason, either, tenants have left. Sometimes that's a hospital that's been in a location for 10 years and they decided to go build their own building. It could be that the landlord previous to them didn't have a lot of healthcare real estate experience, and they were trying to treat the healthcare tenants like other tenants, and the healthcare tenants just got sick of it, or they weren't keeping up with the property. So for whatever reason, it has low or struggling vacancy, maybe some capital improvements that need to be made, and they know what to do to go in there. They can underwrite it, and they know, that they can turn it around in X number of months and sell it, or they want to keep it long term. So, they want to go in and buy the property as a value add, and they want to have the economic benefit of turning it around. That also happens, for owner users of if you're an owner user, you may want to get a building that has some tenants in it for some rental revenue, but that you need a space for your practice, but you don't want to go and um, you know, buy something top of the market because you want the economic benefit as, the healthcare company that's going to be occupying most of the space. So there's that aspect. There's the people that only want to they don't want to lease up space. There's the investors that are looking just for cash flow. They want, a healthcare company to develop their own building, use their own cost of capital. Once they put a lease on it, they'll buy it from them, with the lease in place. And so there's that scenario. There's sale leasebacks. I mean, there's just a ton of different aspects, and it depends. Do you want to purchase it for the cash flow, or are you looking to, purchase it for the value, just like any other asset class?
So most of the folks that are on here aren't particularly institutional investors that listen to the podcast. So, is there a particular method that you find works best for an inexperienced investor versus an experienced one?
Yes, but they don't usually like this because I do recommend that they JV. I think that there's a lot of opportunities out there to JV. I think private capital is going to be heavily active this year, and if you have private capital and you want to mitigate your risk, I would recommend that you partner either with somebody that has a ton of experience in this space, or somehow get into a partnership of some sort where there's, people bringing capital, people bringing knowledge, and, maybe you're the glue that puts them together and you go after these opportunities. So, I think private capital, they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, nor should they. And the best way to do that is to develop these mutually beneficial partnerships where if you can find a good one, you just keep you can just replicate that deal after deal.
So we've definitely talked about folks JVing and kind of looking at unique opportunities in the private equity and in the private capital space. For somebody who might be interested in doing that in the medical office asset class, what's your best recommendation? Because I'm sure you have unique insight.
Yeah. So I think you need to work with somebody that has, let me see how to answer that. So unique insight. I think my unique insight really isn't, you know, healthcare real estate specific, but I think being easy to work with and flexible would be, would be good. Coming to the table with, obviously you're going to say, hey, these are some structures that have been successful in the past, but listening to people that have done structures that are unique to, the specific asset class. So for example, there's one thing in medical office, I I think as we go forward, and it's always been there and it sort of waxes and wanes, but offering ownership to these physician groups, having a percentage, they're not voting members. They don't, they don't get they aren't part of decision making, but there's a percentage of ownership that they give for, and you can say you have to sign a 10-year lease or a 12-year lease or, and for that, you'll get a percentage of ownership, maybe also having a piece of the ownership that they can buy into the, they can own more of it if they want to purchase shares. Those are some of the structures that I see being most successful. One, it keeps the stickiness of the tenant. Then they tell their friends. I mean, the success of a medical office building really is a tenant mix that, they want to stay there because if they leave, it's going to be more difficult for their patients. So, for example, if there's a family practice that has a lab and an imaging center that they use in the same building, or an orthopedic group that's in there, and they all, have sort of a referral patient base where it's easy for the patient. I think when you're getting into the mind of your user, you constantly say, they care about their patients. They're concerned about their patients. So if you're concerned about their patients and you help them, then you're going to be a successful healthcare real estate investor. But, there's some knowledge that comes with that. And doctors, they are a little bit of, a different breed. In fact, that some of the, it's an intelligent group, but they have very little time. And so they want to know information, but they want to know it quickly. And sometimes you do have to let them think that they know more than you. And that's hard. When you get a lot of egos in the room, sometimes they don't want to play well together. Well, doctors had big egos, and if they didn't, they probably wouldn't be very good at what they do because they wouldn't be confident. So, you have to understand your target market really well. And I would say be flexible and easy to work with that target market. But I have seen over, the 20 plus years I've been in this business, is if you can develop a relationship with a strong relationship, they stay, they continue with you. If you buy another building and they need to open up another site, or they, share the information with your friends, if you get a good reputation with this client base, they're pretty loyal, and they can usually continue to work with you. One, because they don't have the time to really start a new relationship if they don't have to. I mean, if they have to, they will. But typically, if they can develop a good team of people that they know, they're going to stay with them.
Look, we've had great relationships over the years with investors who are physicians,
Mhm.
and I would, reiterate that's very true. They do not typically have the time because they're working in very high intensity practices,
Mhm.
and as long as you're delivering good returns, usually you're going to have a great relationship.
Exactly
So
right.
on kind of that note of equity, and you touched on equity and capital. We're coming into a unique period of time. We were in a Goldilocks period beforehand, with capital rates just being, you know, ridiculously low, at least by standards of the last 100 years, right?
Right.
Um, and now that we're in kind of this more traditional period of equity, but still a much higher interest rate environment, has that changed the dynamic for investors in the market, at least for you?
So I think it depends on who you're talking to, because I remember buying my first house at 8.5% interest rate. So, you know,
Exactly.
I so historically, we're still historically low, but we're higher than what we used to be. So
Yeah,
people are, if you've only been in the market for 10 years, you're getting hit like a brick right now, because
yeah,
it's like, you know, the interest rates have doubled in 18 months, right?
yeah.
And so, you're having a hard time digesting this. Then there's the people that have been through a higher interest rate market before this, and you have to adjust. Will you be able to buy as bigger buildings? Maybe not. Do you have to maybe take a smaller piece, maybe reduce returns a little bit, for yourself? You just have, you're going to have to think about it a little bit differently. Are you going to be able to go out? Are you going to have to raise more equity than debt? Probably. Um, so there's just different ways that you're going to have to put deals together in order to be able to achieve the same or even, better returns. But, people are going to have to dig in and get creative and, run some numbers. And is it going to be as easy? No, absolutely not. Because, you're going to have to come up with, um, just you're going to have to come up with strategies that work in a higher interest rate environment.
So, um, one of the things that we've seen in other asset classes has been it's the high interest rate environment has affected build outs in particular because folks are looking at how much capital am I deploying, and there's an increased hesitancy towards spending big dollars on build outs. The medical industry and medical office is particularly well known for having expensive build outs.
Mhm.
Can you discuss a little bit about how you typically perceive build outs for an investment, and if there are some strategies to manage and mitigate costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the well, so medical office tenants, they do expect a landlord to contribute. Um,
Yeah.
you know, so let's say, I mean, I think now it's easy to say that typical medical office build out would be like $100 a square foot. The specialty build outs, the tenants, while they obviously would love the landlord to, pay for it, they are um, educated. They're experienced enough to know that, if their build out is $150 a square foot because it's super expensive, they'll get what they can from the landlord, and they understand that they're going to have to fund the rest. And they know in their head how much that it costs to open up a new site for themselves. Um, but let's say the typical average from a shell, is on a good day in my market, and it's probably going to be a little bit different in other markets, especially California, New York, that sort of thing. But let's just use $100 a square foot for easy math. They will expect the landlord to contribute 50 of that, and for that, the landlord can ask for 10 years flat. Yeah, I mean, just 10 years right off the door is the standard. Then they can start to, maybe it's 11 or 12 years that they start, if the tenant wants a little bit more. Then you can start playing with the lease rate. The lease rate is always, as you can't increase it too much because it'll just get, it won't be underwritten that way. And it'll just, so, you can play with it a little bit, but you can't amortize everything. So we all know that game. It is going to just be playing with the numbers. It's going to also be, I think, competitively bidding things. That you'll have to competitively bid, because it'll just be, some contractors have had some forethought, I know, and stocked up on materials, and some haven't, and some will be able to do it in a different time frame than others. So again, it's going to take a lot of, I think, upfront legwork. I would, you have to interview contractors, because some of them have been successful through the pandemic and some haven't, and you don't want to get stuck in the middle of a build out and not be able to finish, or you know that's just a mess. So but I think leases will probably go longer than 10 years. But I do think that you need to raise enough capital to be able to be competitive in tenant improvements in order to have a successful medical office building.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, the one of the most underrated things that I don't think enough brokers talk about is a well-capitalized landlord, and we're certainly entering an environment where that's becoming more important than ever. So
Absolutely.
so kind of going towards the end of the interview, we're going to talk a little bit about exits, and
Okay.
and you've had a reputation actually as being a particular specialist or a particular expert at exit strategies. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the 1031 exchange. Everybody doesn't like to pay taxes, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. Nobody wants to pay taxes, right? So, uh, can you tell our viewers a little bit about what a 1031 exchange is and how it factors into medical office investing?
Yes. So if you're selling a property, so I help a lot of physicians maximize the value of their physician-owned property. So when they come to me and they want to sell, I help them understand, that they need to put a long-term lease in place, and then they can sell to these investors that typically are 1031 buyers. 1031 buyers, they are, as they're looking for investment properties to buy after they sell, in order to take advantage of the 1031 tax deferral um, opportunity. So you have to be a little bit cautious, because if they've identified too many and put yours under contract, then don't select yours. But I luckily haven't had that happen. They are looking for quality tenants. They are looking, the first thing they want to see is the lease and your financials. So I've struggled with some physicians not wanting to release their practice financial. If they're a strong enough practice, they don't have to release their personals. It just depends on their on the buyer and the practice. But immediately now, I don't even go to market without having practice financials. So they want to see those two things first. That is, these investors are buying the cash flow. They're buying the cash flow. They are underwriting it based on their opinion of the financial strength of the tenant. Um, so that's on the buyer side. Now, if you're for these physicians, or investors, whichever, if they're selling this and they want to do a 1031 exchange, they can go into other investment properties. Some have wanted to, start going into the short-term rental market. Sometimes they actually sell this and buy another property or two to put their uh, practice in, or they're going to buy another practice and then they're going to put that in, so that there's a variety of ways that you can use it if you're selling a property and you don't want to take the tax hit on those proceeds, but it has to go into an investment property of some sort. But that's what I tell physicians, and or an investor, the maximum value of your property is when either for an investor, when the WALT is the highest, or for a physician owned building, when you are the tenant in there and you put a long-term lease on it. So if you can maximize the value with those opportunities, then you can take the proceeds and go and do other investment opportunities with them.
Definitely a great method for looking at potentially exiting and kind of deferring tax. But there are risks that come about, right? So I was wondering if you could kind of touch, look, there's never a free lunch, right? So
Right.
what are some of the risks and drawbacks that you've seen, or at least you've seen from other agents and brokers in the market when selling a medical office property?
Um, what are the risks and drawbacks
Of at least the
for
1031 exchange process? Because I think, look, no one wants to pay taxes.
right? So obviously identifying a property. So if you're thinking of doing a 1031 and selling a property, I would have in mind some properties that you're already looking at, because but it, the timing is everything, because the sales cycle might be longer than you expected. They might need an extra 30 days to close for whatever reason. There might need to be something fixed in due diligence, which extends the sales cycle. So, you have to, I would say, have a variety of properties that are potential for you to be able to strike on once that timeline, is known. So the 1031 exchange is a little bit time sensitive. So there's the reverse 1031 exchange, um, which I think is a great opportunity if you want to try to mitigate your risk. But again, there's always risk in selling. So if you buy a property, and do the reverse exchange, but your property doesn't sell in the time frame, there's always a risk. So that's just, if that's for somebody that makes sense for. I would say, you know, put the property on the market, get a sense of the activity. If it looks like it's going to go fast, have some properties that you can move on fast, but then, have different buckets of properties that you can move on immediately, properties that you can move on in a couple months, and then properties that might take a little bit of time, so that you have a little bit different variety of things that you can go into and, try to mitigate that time. But the 1031, it's a time sensitive strategy for sure.
And you talk about it as a time sensitive strategy. What are kind of some of those time limits that folks are worried about? Because I think there are a lot of investors that we talk to that'll be like, "Oh, I want a 1031," and then you're like, "Well, I just don't think it's going to be plausible within your time frame." So what kind of is that time limit that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you have 45 days to identify, the property. Um, and then, from there, I think the timing starts to change with what you need. But the 45-day to identify new properties is the big one. So you have to, have some properties that you can invest in 45 days and realistically close on, um, pretty soon thereafter. So so that is the time frame. And it's when you're looking at investment properties and you're working with physicians, 45 days is not a lot, to
No.
look for properties, see if they're viable, negotiate with, you know, either through another broker or direct with the owner, which they have lives of their own. So, you know, when you do a 1031, if that's something you're looking to do with the proceeds, I recommend that you start that as a parallel path with the sales process and be able to time it appropriately.
Yeah. Yeah. Great advice.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about timing and we're running out of time on the podcast. Um, we're going to get to our real estate final four questions. And
Okay.
so we're going to kind of start off with, I think, one of the most important questions that we ask, which is uh, 10 years from now, what do you think will have changed most about the medical office industry? And what are some of the trends that you're seeing that are big picture that some of our investors or some of our uh, agents or real estate professionals can kind of expect to see over the next decade?
So what happens in healthcare, and it has, with HMOs it started and stuff like that. So right now there's a trend. A lot of private equity firms are buying medical practices, or hospitals are buying medical practices, and physicians are becoming employees. So if they're older physicians, that has been a great solution for having to figure out the electronic medical systems and all of these new regulations with the Accountable Care Act. But then doctors start getting a little frustrated, if they're younger, they either just have different ideas and speed of things that they want to do operationally. They have opinions about how things are being done that they don't like, that, you can't fight with a big bureaucratic hospital. You can't make those changes. And so I see that, while they're getting bought now, I will see, once they have so they typically have to stay an employee for a certain amount of time. And once that burns off, I see them breaking out into private practice again.
So I think that's definitely where it's headed in a lot. We're seeing a real diversification of kind of who's deciding to come into private practice or even within a broader concept with entrepreneurial businesses. Real estate is an entrepreneurial environment. And I was wondering, one of our questions we always ask folks is, if you could start your career over again, what advice would you give young Trisha?
I would have started a capital raising real estate investment group immediately that, starts in, obviously it would be smaller buildings at first, but then, build into bigger buildings and then eventually a fund.
Yeah. Hey, look, everyone loves equity, right? So at least when it's good. So I would heavily recommend that to all of our listeners who have had successful careers. Go out and start that fund. Look, I work for a group that has a large fund. I love operating in a world where you have not only the ability to gain equity, but the ability to create long-term generational wealth. And for all of our folks who are potential investors, do it. Just take that leap of faith, because it's never too soon. The third question we ask everybody on the podcast is a business book or a real estate book that's influenced your career. We've had a lot of great ones over the years. I'm curious, what's yours?
Oh gosh, there's so many, but the one I think that has stuck with me the most is Simon Sinek's, Ask the Why, or it's
Oh yeah.
something with the why. Yeah. I think that's incredibly important because, he talks about, we all talk about what we do. We all talk about how we do it, but we typically don't talk about why we do it. And so that's been something I've been working on. Why do I get up every day? Why am I so excited to come here? And, you know, I was having a conversation with my son at dinner yesterday, and he in high school was doing sports medicine. And now when he's looking at colleges, he's thinking he wants to go into sports business. So I asked him why the change. And then, in his senior year, he could take like an advanced sports medicine. And he said, because he's like, I can't stand the blood. And if you can't stand the blood, my understanding is you can't really be successful in sports medicine. And I said, that's true. And I said, that's why I do what I do. Like, I know I do not have the capability to operate on someone. I mean, obviously, it was one of my kids, but I would be more dangerous than anything else. But, I like even giving a shot to someone, like, to me, like there's a whole fear and like anxiety that I get thinking about doing that. But I can, do the business side of it and help these people who are gifted in doing that, gifted in healing, gifted in these really, intricate procedures, and they're able to help people. I can help them. I can help these physicians help their patients in the business side of everything, which while some of them are well adversed in doing it, do they have the time to do it? And, out of the 24 hours in the day that they have, and, they need to go to work and create the most revenue possible, is that on the business side, or is that doing what they do in the clinic side, and then being able to go home and have, happy lives with their families, and, have other things to do rather than work as a clinician doing all of this stuff and then going and having to do all the business side of it as well.
Simon Sinek is a great great influence on the business world and a great voice for asking that why and so many other questions. We'd love to have him on the podcast. I'm not sure he's going to, um, but
He's a great guest.
he would. I'd love to have you on, Simon. So who's the next person, besides Simon, that has influenced you in the real estate world that we should have on the podcast?
In the real estate world. So I think, so one of my people that I really admire but she's very local to my local market, but it's Sharon Harper from the Plaza Companies. I mean, she is a female medical office developer. She created medical office in Phoenix and I think nationally as an industry. She's just such an icon. She is still married to the same man. She's raised 5 children. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly impressive because, sometimes you're always having to say, am I going to work or do I need to get home to my family? And there's, sometimes it's a struggle because you're just like, oh, if I just stay 10 more minutes, but then, like you come racing in for dinner and nothing's done actually. And then you're like, oh, so, there's always that pull, and to just have, and I'm sure she has stories among stories of how challenging that was, but in the end, she did it. And I think that, as we're all adjusting to this new normal where you can do Zoom interviews like this and we don't have to fly to each other. And, for these physicians, being able to accept the help and, be able to go home and not think about it. I mean, I think we all have to think about how valuable our time is going for, as we, progress through life and where we want to spend it. So I just think she for me in real estate, specifically in my market, is somebody that I do admire and we talk often. So she's a great person.
Well, as somebody who's looking down the future of having additional little ones in my life, I'll say this: I'd love to have her on the podcast just for that alone. But she sounds like a wonderful person to bring on, and we'll have to get her contact information. So, beyond her contact information, if folks want to reach out to you and they want to learn more about medical office space, learn more about that 1031 process, or just reach out for someone who can give great insight into how to work in the real estate industry, what's the best place for folks to reach out to you?
So the best way is if they want to go onto the website, which is www.docproperties.com, and then they can schedule a call with me there. That way, it's in their time zone and there's not an exchange of 20 emails trying to figure out, which time zone is what. And if a time doesn't work, emailing me, at ttalbot@docproperties.com. I would, the phone number on there is on the website as well under contact. And so, you can get to me that way as well. But I know that everyone's busy and a lot of people like to text and email and stuff like that. So I think that's the easiest way for everybody to get connected as quickly as possible, but you're always welcome to reach out via email or call directly. And, I just find that after a couple of times of exchanging voicemails, people start to get pretty frustrated. So I just offer an easy button if you want it. And then if you have your own method, feel free. I have all my contact information, easy to reach.
Trisha, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. And look, we definitely have to have you on in the future and explain a little bit more about what's going on in the market. Thanks for hopping on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a 5-star rating, or a review. Your comments and interactions and subscriptions matter for the podcast algorithm, and they help us continue to get guests our viewers want to listen to and learn from. You can follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.